Okay, let's get started. Welcome. I'm Marie Harvey. I'm the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences here at Oregon State University, and I'm delighted that you're joining the seminar today. I'm also pleased to introduce Laurel Kinsel. Laurel is an Associate Professor in Environmental and Occupational Health here in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences, and she's joined us today and will provide an introduction for our distinguished speaker, and she will moderate this session. Laura will also provide more instructions about the format for the seminar and how to ask your questions. Let's get started, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurel Kinsel. Laurel, take it away.
Thanks, Marie. Welcome everyone to the College of Public Health and Human Sciences Friday Research Seminar. We're glad you're able to join us for this research presentation via Zoom. All of you guests are muted, and so to ask a question, please use the Q&A that's found at the bottom in Zoom. I will be moderating it and then repeating the questions to Rick after the presentation today. So I am so pleased to present our speaker today. I have had the pleasure of working with Dr. Neitzel at our service with ACGIH, and I admire his enthusiasm and his leadership and appreciate his friendship for sure. So Rick Neitzel is an associate professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, currently under snow conditions. He serves as the director of the Industrial Hygiene Program and is also the associate director for the Office of Global Public Health and the Center for Occupational Health and Safety Engineering. Dr. Neitzel is an exposure scientist who research focuses on the characterization of a wide range of environmental and occupational exposures and the adverse health effects associated with these. Today, he's going to focus on his global work with the informal electronic waste recyclers who face a wide range of occupational health and safety challenges. Rick, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to your talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laurel, for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. It is coming on 5 o'clock, so I'll try not to speed through this here, but I'm going to talk to you for 40 minutes or so about some work, as you heard Laurel said, that my team and I have been doing with informal e-waste recyclers. So I'll go ahead and share my slides here, and we'll get off to the races. So let me just begin here with a sort of broad question to everybody, which is, why are we concerned about electronic waste recycling in the first place? Why should we do this? And I want you to keep in mind as we run through my slides here, you're going to see some pictures. You can see one here on the right of conditions that look pretty rough, certainly from an occupational health perspective, not optimal. Lots of waste lying around, and you may think, well, gosh, what an awful industry. Why are they doing this? But I do want everyone to keep in mind right from the outset here that recycling e-waste is absolutely something we must do. This is a green industry, and that we are saving ourselves from having to mine virgin materials to create new electronics, and instead are recovering these previously used materials. I also want to highlight that of all the waste streams that we have globally, the fastest growing waste stream is electronic waste or e-waste. And so you can see here estimates from a particular research group going back to 2015 and projecting out to this year, showing a very linear increase and a very rapid increase in the amount of this stuff that we're creating, from about 17 million tons a year back in 2015 up to an estimated almost 60 million tons a year in 2021. So we are generating a huge amount of this stuff. And the reason I show the picture in the lower right here, so this is in fact from the community in Thailand that I'm going to be talking with you about. You can see, for example, all of those old style TVs, probably that many of you maybe had in your household growing up, these old cathode ray tube TVs. You know, this was cutting edge technology for many decades. We've all moved on to LCD or LED screens now, but these TVs are still out there, and they are a resource to be recycled. So a little bit more about e-waste. Some of you may know or may have heard of the Basel Convention. So virtually every country that is a member country of the United Nations has signed the Basel Convention. And in doing so, they basically agreed that they are not going to permit any transboundary movement of hazardous waste, meaning we don't have one country shipping its hazardous waste to another country. I will point out that of all the signatories, countries of the United Nations, one very critical one did not sign on to the Basel Convention, and that's the United States. As a result, lots of other countries around the world have a better handle on their production and movement of electronic waste. We are kind of in the dark because we aren't required to track these things in the way that other countries agreed to. Many of you have no doubt heard of e-waste at this point, and I will highlight probably some of the media coverage that you've seen about e-waste has been maybe somewhat inflammatory, or maybe very inflammatory in the case of this picture in the upper left, where we're looking at workers operating under some pretty terrible conditions. These photos here were taken from what used to be one of the world's largest e-waste recycling sites, Agbogbloshie Market in Accra, Ghana, where I started out doing my own work on electronic waste. And so you can get a sense here of just how much contamination there is. There's air pollution, there's water pollution, there's pretty harsh conditions for the workers. This is maybe a little bit sensationalized, but I can tell you, having been to this site, it's also reality. Not all of the conditions on site look exactly like this, but you can certainly observe these things. And so you can get a sense from an occupational health perspective, these people need help. We want to make sure that we're doing this recycling, which again is a green industry, but we don't want to do it in a way that's harming the workforce. And of course, all of us, myself included, have some blame to play or to take in this game here. We all generate electronic waste. So this table here is showing the amount of electronic waste generated in total and also per capita for a number of different countries around the world. I will highlight here, you may think of e-waste as your old laptop or your old cell phone, and that's absolutely correct. But you can see here, there are a lot of other things that have electronic components in it: refrigerators, televisions, printers, air conditioners. All of these things have some electronic circuitry that can be recovered, again, in this green recycling sense. But I will highlight here, there's two countries on this list that I want to point us to. One is China. And you can see China, the fourth one down here, at the time of this graph, which was put out in 2011, was putting out about 2 million tons of electronic waste per year. You can see we're basically neck and neck with the United States down towards the bottom. We were just slightly above that amount. But a key difference here, China, of course, has a quite large population, so their per capita generation was much, much lower. Whereas if you quickly scan across this list here, you can see the United States, in terms of per capita e-waste generation, is not at the top of the list. We're sort of squarely in the middle here, but we're certainly creating more per person than a country like China is. My point here is everybody around the globe is contributing to some degree to this generation of e-waste. And again, I just want to move us away from this concept I think that some people have when they first come to this concept of e-waste, that, oh, it's just old cell phones, basically. And so here's a table from back in 2014, basically showing the relative contribution of different kinds of electronic waste to the total amount produced. And you can see mobile phones are actually just a small fraction of this. There's lamps, screens, thermostats, large equipment, which would be refrigerators and stoves and sort of white household appliances, as well as small equipment, again, like coffee makers and fax machines and printers. So e-waste comes in many different flavors, if you will. I want to highlight again this notion of the Basel Convention, which basically says we shouldn't have any hazardous waste moving back and forth across national boundaries. And what the map here is showing you is basically the movement of hazardous waste across national boundaries. And so you can see, while many countries are signatory to the Basel Convention, there are flows of electronic waste occurring around the entire globe, including from the United States, from the European Union, and from other high-income countries, generally to low and middle-income countries. Now, the thing I'll acknowledge here is there are valid reasons why electronics get shipped from country to country. And I have experienced myself in my work in Ghana, shiploads arriving from Western Europe and the United States of electronics. And these were electronics that were donated basically by those countries or by third parties in those countries to bridge the digital divide. So in theory, these are usable electronics that a high-income country is transferring to a lower middle-income country, so people there can benefit from electronics and access to the internet and all the things we take for granted. And that's great. That's a wonderful idea. Unfortunately, most of these shipments are just filled with obsolete electronics. So this is not a donation of usable electronics, but rather a transfer of hazardous waste, which again is forbidden by the Basel Convention. So I want to point out that the United States is far from being alone in generating e-waste and moving it to other countries. This is indeed a whole global ecosystem. And part of my research motivation was to try to understand what are the impacts of this e-waste, regardless of where it comes from, on communities in low and middle income countries. So just one more slide here to convince you that recycling e-waste is in fact a good idea. The graph on the left here is basically showing the differences in costs between actually recycling old CRT tubes, so these are old style cathode ray tube TVs, versus getting those same resources from virgin mining. So, you know, throwing away the TV and getting new resources out of the ground through mining. And you can see here, the costs of CRT recycling are trivial compared to the costs of doing new mining. So from a financial perspective, it makes great sense to take these old electronics and recycle them rather than simply to throw away, which is unfortunately commonly done in many places, and go mine new minerals out of the ground to create new electronics. So this is a good thing again, but I want to highlight, you know, while we have valuable minerals and metals, particularly in electronic waste, and you can see a couple of examples here. If we look at what's in e-waste, there's silver, there's copper, there's tin and zinc. These are metals that have some retail value. So these are valuable things that we should be recovering. And that's great. We want to get those out of the e-waste. The bad thing is you can see on here, there are a whole slew of pretty nasty sounding chemicals. And you don't need to be an environmental health professional to know, gosh, lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, these things are chemicals we read about in the popular press. We know these things are toxic to humans and they're toxic to the environment. So the trick here is we want to get the good stuff out of the e-waste without inadvertently releasing or exposing people to this bad stuff to the extent we can. I want to also make one additional point here, which is I think many people, including myself, sort of have this gut reaction of, well, okay, if recycling is good, we should be doing this in a formal way. We should have companies out there recovering electronics and doing this service in an organized fashion, rather than what I'm going to focus on, which is informal e-waste workers. And I think many lay folk assume, well, if we have a formal system, that's going to be better at recovering more materials from this e-waste. And that is absolutely wrong, actually. I was surprised to learn. So the figure we're looking at here is a comparison of the different steps of e-waste recycling for a formal system compared to an informal system. So formal, again, we've got a business. This is an organization that does this in a sort of above the board manner. Informal, you know, can sort of intersect with the black market in some cases, and it's not businesses doing this, but rather individuals. And so I won't focus on the individual details for the whole figure here, but I will highlight one of the key differences between a formal and an informal system. So in a formal system, the business needs the income, but the individual workers are just there sort of making their income as part of their job. Whereas in an informal system, people's entire livelihood is dependent on how much e-waste they recycle. And so informal systems have much higher rates of collection of e-waste in the first place. They also are taking everything apart by hand. So they have this whole pre-processing step that is much more efficient than what we do in a formal system, which is basically chuck it into a shredder and tear it all apart. They are not so good at getting the last final bits of metal and other materials out. So a formal system does a much better job at that final processing stage. But because the informal sector is so much better at collection and pre-processing, we end up with a higher recovery, a higher net yield with an informal system system than we do in a formal system. So I don't mean to have you take away from this talk that we should ban or otherwise try to regulate informal recycling to put it out of business, because in fact it's more effective and more efficient than formal systems are. So I've been talking about e-waste recycling now for 10 minutes or so, and I haven't really shown you what that entails. So I want to take a few minutes here and just walk you through what this looks like. And these are pictures that I've taken in the communities in Thailand that we have been working with now for the past 4 years, going on 5 years actually. So one of the first things we have to do when we recycle e-waste is actually get out there and collect the waste in the first place. And so you can see on the left, there's a truck in the background. This truck drives around. Over time, organically, this community has created relationships with other communities. So each community knows, gosh, on Thursday, someone's going to be coming by to pick up old computers. So it's a very effective but totally informal system. They collect all these computers. These are the cases of desktop computers on the left, and on the right, you can see a small independent operator here who's decided to focus on recycling televisions. So the first step, again, we got to collect this stuff before we can do anything with it. The second step is we're still collecting things here and sorting them into different types of materials. So the community we're working with does absolutely accept old cell phones, but they don't have the technology or sort of the wherewithal to actually, for example, take apart and recycle a battery from a cell phone. So on the left here, you can see they get cell phones and they take the batteries out, and they have a relationship with a sort of consortium in Bangkok, which is several hundred miles away, where they send those batteries. So again, we've got a whole ecosystem going here. On the right-hand side, you can see the green printed circuit boards that are so common in electronics all around us. And so they'll sort these and get these, again, into their own flow, basically. Some communities will actually melt down these printed circuit boards in acid vats. This particular community does not. So they'll get all the metal off there they can, and then they will send these printed circuit boards to actually another community where they can be ultimately broken down. So it's a surprisingly sophisticated process for being completely informal. So still on the collecting and sorting, on the right-hand side, you can see here all of those televisions, the old CRT televisions. So we've got to get the plastic casing off those to get to the valuable metals inside. I will point out there's an electron gun basically in the back of each of these televisions, and there's about 4 pounds of lead in that neck and backing of each of these CRT tubes. So here we're looking at a tremendous volume or mass basically of lead that's been accumulated as part of these CRT tubes in someone's backyard, waiting to be further taken apart. On the left-hand side, you're looking at basically what happens to stuff that doesn't quite make the cut through the sorting process. So fluorescent light bulbs have electronics in them. As you know, though, they're also filled with things like mercury. This community doesn't have the capacity to deal with mercury, and in fact, they haven't found anybody in Thailand who does. So unfortunately, when they come across a fluorescent tube, that ends straight up in their mixed-use landfill. So they've got municipal waste from households coming in here. They've also got electronic waste coming in here. So you can already see that efficient though they are, there's some obvious opportunities for improvement here in terms of, for example, recovering those fluorescent tubes instead of just discarding them. Okay, so now we come to the third step here, which is actually dismantling. And I'll tell you, this particular community in Thailand, if any of you have traveled to Southeast Asia, air conditioning is not so common in rural areas. So most houses will have a ton of either desk or floor fans just to cool things off. I can tell you, really during all the times that I've been to Thailand, which is many, I feel like the temperature has only rarely been about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or less. So the region we work in is quite warm. They need to stay cool. At the end of its service life, each of those fans has a motor inside, and inside that motor is a stator here, a winding of copper. And copper is one of the most sort of desirable metals to get out of these electronics, because there's a very strong and robust market for it in Thailand. And so this is the ultimate goal, is to get as many fan motors as you can, break the stators apart, and get the copper out. And so just to give you an idea or a quick introduction as to what this looks like, I asked one of the workers if I could sit at their workstation and try to take one of these things apart on my own. And I'll play you the video here. I understand it may be a little laggy on your end, but hopefully it's interpretable enough. I'll also point out, you can't see, but I'm actually sitting on some discarded waste myself, a little bucket type apparatus. It took me like 4 tries just to sit down and not fall off this thing. So clearly I'm not cut out for this line of work. But you can get a sense here. I'm taking a hammer and some pliers basically, and I'm trying to pull this bundle of copper out of this housing that it sits in. And I'm doing this in a really awkward posture with basically no protective equipment. I have this flimsy cotton glove on my left hand, and I can assure you, because I've experienced this, each one of those little copper wires goes right through that cotton glove and stabs you in the hand. So this is the kind of work you might imagine doing in some cases for 8 hours a day, sitting on a bucket, taking apart hundreds, if not thousands, of these little fan motors to get the contents inside. There are some more mechanized ways to do this. So the gentleman here in the middle of the picture has his own independent shop, as all these folks do, whereas the previous slide was a shop, and they do call themselves shops, focusing mostly on fans. You can see this guy is more of an opportunist. So he does have some fans, as you see in the foreground here. He's also got a copying machine here on the left-hand side. These white plastic-looking objects in the back left are the housings off of washing machines. He's got portable radios, just about anything he can get his hands on. And in the case of this guy, he's actually got a power tool. So he's got a screw gun basically that he's using to take these devices apart. If you've got that, great. If you don't, many people will have to resort just to sort of brute violence to break these things apart and get into the components inside. Most of these shops, as I said, are sort of independent single family operations, but this community is very interesting in that they have some sort of co-op shops as well. And so this is an example of a co-op. So all these folks work here 8 hours a day or more if there's enough business. They've got a giant mound of e-waste and electrical waste in the middle of them, and each of them is just taking apart as much of this stuff as they can, as fast as they can. And at the end of the day, these folks have agreed that they'll basically split the profits. So it is truly a co-op. You can see here, some of these folks are wearing respiratory protection. So from an environmental and occupational health perspective, you know, we start thinking about what might these folks be exposed to. You can see this woman in the back actually has a whole head covering on. I can tell you in the case of this woman and many other workers like her, men and women alike, when we ask them, are you wearing that because you're concerned about getting things in your eye or breathing stuff in, they said, no, I don't want to get stuff in my hair because I don't necessarily have facilities to clean it off regularly. So we're dealing with a very low income community here and absolutely have to be sensitive to that. There is, nevertheless, in this community, a whole range of sophistication. So here's another shop where these folks are not interested in the metals from the electronics, but they actually buy the plastics. So, you know, your iPhone, your television, all these things are housed in plastic. And these folks have invested in an industrial grade shredder where they will put plastics in, and you can see little shredded plastic comes out the other end. So some machine guarding issues, there's all sorts of occupational safety concerns going on here. But again, this is a relatively sophisticated operation that deals only in one aspect of e-waste, which is plastic in this case. And so you can see these folks have potentially very high noise exposures. So we come now to the final step, which is extraction and burning. And so no matter how efficient these workers are, whoops, my video doesn't seem to be working on this screen, no problem. No matter how efficient these folks are, there are inevitably points of the process where the fastest way to get the metals out is just to burn whatever is surrounding the metals. And so this is that local mixed waste landfill where their household municipal waste is going, but also the e-waste is heading off to. And so you can see here, it's not uncommon to go any time of day really into this landfill and find a burning pile of something. And I can tell you in this case on the right, what these folks did, a particular shop ended up with a bunch of jumper cables. Jumper cables have a huge amount of copper in them. So they basically have figured there's no faster or more efficient way to get the copper outside of the rubber or plastic coating than to set it on fire. And so they will bring stuff out there, burn it. You can see the wire here is the pinkish colored objects, and all the gray there is ash from the coating on the wires that they've burned away. And at the end of the day, again, for this community, really what most folks are interested in is copper and any other metals that they can get their hands on, but primarily copper. And so I can tell you, I've now looked at e-waste sites on 4 different continents. At the end of the day, it all looks exactly like this. Someone's got a bucket or a tub or some other container filled with as much copper as they can get. And they'll then take that basically to a middleman or a merchant, and that person will buy the copper from them, and then that person will then sort of inject that copper back into the raw material stream. So it might go to a foundry, for example, to be melted down and recreated into new metal. So this is money, what we're looking at right here. And the folks like to end up with as much of this at the end of the day as they possibly can. So I'll give you a little better sense of the community we're working in here. This is the setting. It's a quite idyllic kind of pastoral view. If you've ever seen a rice paddy before, I find them incredibly peaceful. You can find water buffalo wandering around among them in this community. But in this very setting that I took the picture, if you turn around and move 100 meters behind you, you're looking at this. So that rice paddy that I showed you abuts right up next to this mixed waste landfill. You can see in the background here, if you can make it out, there's a truck. Someone who's brought some e-waste here to burn and extract. All the yellow materials you see here are insulation from refrigerators and washing machines and stoves. Lots of isocyanates in there. These things burn quite well, so they often use that insulation to set their fires to liberate the metals here. I'll also point out, you may be able to see in the back right hand of the picture here a pool of sort of murky looking water. This is an area where unfortunately, I'll say the local government had an idea that they wanted to convert this landfill into a sanitary landfill by digging a pit and lining it with impermeable materials and creating a sort of cappable landfill. So they were able to cobble together some money to hire an excavation crew and dig a pit, but sort of failed to anticipate that this is a very wet area. You have to have a lot of water to grow rice, and the pit filled with water immediately, and they didn't have enough money to actually complete the lining. So now we've got essentially a water system that actually is connected to the rice paddies next to it, which is most unfortunate, and as you can see, very contaminated. Here's another picture, just again, a different aspect of this landfill. So you can see, again, white plastic bags filled with household garbage, very much mixed with this electronic waste recycling that's going on. I'll also highlight, you can see sort of in a line from the center of the picture to the right, this wall. So one of the other things this local government did was try to wall in this facility to at least identify it as inside there is our landfill. Unfortunately, the wall doesn't extend all the way around. And as you can see, the materials being disposed of here are being sort of stacked up against the wall and will probably eventually overtop it. So this is tragic from an occupational health perspective. I hate to see a government spend money on controls designed to protect the public and occupational health, but really not in an effective way. Here's a shot. Basically, every time we roll into this community, which has been a couple times a year for many years now, you can tell if somebody's out actually burning at the e-waste site, because you'll see this really gnarly looking plume of black smoke on the horizon. And as you get closer to this site, again, it's very quickly evident where that burning is going on. And so once again, I just want to highlight on the right-hand side of this photo is the inside of this mixed-use landfill. On the left side of that wall, running down the center, is a rice paddy that's used for food. So again, you don't need to be an environmental health professional to realize this may not be an optimal setup for promoting human health. And here just another video so you can see kind of the general ambiance. Lots of smoking piles of who knows what. That truck in the center of the picture right now is someone who actually brought a truckload full of CRTs. What you can't see, because my camera died, is that person was picking up those CRTs. So we looked at the back of those in an earlier picture stacked up in someone's yard. He's taking each of those and he's figured out the quickest way to get that lead removed, because they haven't found a way to economically recycle lead, is to toss that CRT and basically shatter it on the ground. So he's just hucking these old CRT tubes out of the back of his truck and then picking the metals out of the rubble pile, basically. So shifting into why we're there, definitely have concerns about worker health here. So just looking at the images that you've seen so far, you may have already formulated some ideas about problems that these folks face. Certainly musculoskeletal conditions, from being hunched over in awkward positions with lots of repetitive motion. Injuries, certainly a possibility, getting hit in the eye, screwing a screw gun through your foot inadvertently, noise exposure, as I mentioned earlier, but also all these metals that they're working with, they're getting exposed to at the same time, and potentially huge amounts of psychosocial stress. Again, very low income, marginalized community. So those are things that we've looked at in our research. I'll also point out that sanitation and hygiene are huge issues here. Heat stress is a not trivial factor in this community, and potential exposures long-term to carcinogens, for example, that might increase cancer rates in this community. So we've got concerns about the workers. We were also concerned about the community itself. So we've got all these recycling activities going on, but there are people in this community who don't do e-waste recycling. And like many or most, I would say, Thai communities, there are Buddhist temples in this community too. So here's a photo of one of our sampling setups where we were trying to figure out if the local monks were getting exposed to harmful levels of air pollutants. We also had sort of a reaction that you may have had already, which is concerns for rice farming. So again, we've got these idyllic rice paddies. This is a farmer who actually owns that rice paddy and works the rice paddy that's right next to the e-waste site. And he said, unfortunately, I don't have infinite resources or even enough resources to feed my family. So I have to harvest this rice and sell it, but I don't eat it myself because I'm quite concerned for my family that there might be harmful contaminants. So talk about an impossible situation. He has to feed someone. The only land he has is right next to this contaminated site, and he's making very difficult decisions. Again, I'll also mention his site was one that was inadvertently connected by the government with this ill-advised excavation operation. So now we've got a contiguous waterway that connects the landfill to the local rice paddy. That's a terrible idea when you take a look at this water and think, well, is that the water I want my rice growing in? We also have, over the years, sort of gotten concerned just in general about food. I can't tell you how many chickens and turkeys I've seen pecking away at a styrofoam container that came to sort of protect some of the materials that they were moving. Definitely got lots of livestock coexisting with all of this e-waste detritus. And in these Thai homes that we're looking at, there's generally one kitchen table, and it's a sort of semi-indoor outdoor table. And so they'll cook on that, but when they're not cooking on that, they're often working to do recycling work on that same kitchen table. And so in this case, you can see a patch here that we've actually done a surface wipe sample to look for potential deposits of heavy metals, again, on the surface that they cook on and eat from. So I'll spend just a couple minutes here talking about our data collection efforts. We've been back over 3 sampling campaigns, again, multiple times per year for going on 5 years now. And I will say one of the most wonderful things about this whole effort has been the way that we've been able to partner between Michigan and 2 universities in Thailand, Mae Fah Luang University and Kasetsart University, Sakonakan. And so we've had the opportunity to take students from Michigan and have them interact with the Thai students, who all have these very sharp looking school uniforms I'll highlight. But the most integral piece to everything that I'm talking about here has been these women in the center. These are Thai health volunteers. They're community volunteers who basically, out of the goodness of their heart, agree to take care of others in their community. So they've served as translators for us. They've helped us get access to members of the community. They've helped us collect data and deliver results, and just been phenomenal partners in all of this. So I'll just move fairly quickly. I wanted to kind of introduce you to this topic and not so much focus on the results of our particular study here, but I'll mention that we've been working with 130 workers over this period of time. These are folks who have tended to live in the community for their entire lives. This is a community that's very well established, so they've actually been recycling e-waste for going on 20 years now. This is a relative rarity. Most communities have come into electronic waste recycling much more recently. I'll say, about half of our participants were male. A little more than half of them did e-waste recycling as a primary job. Almost all of them were also doing farming as well. So this is not replacing their traditional farming lifestyle, but rather augmenting it. Only 44% had at least a primary education. So most of these folks had less than a 6th grade education. So we're talking a very low income, marginalized, low SES community. And so what we've done in this community through these various campaigns is to go out and do personal air sampling. And in this case, you can see one of our participants getting connected to a sampling pump. We've been looking for metals, so lead, zinc, iron, copper, cadmium, manganese, and a few others, things that we anticipate them being exposed to based on those things being present in electronic waste. We've tried to take as close to a full shift measurement as we can. I will tell you, many of the samples have been below the limited detection, meaning they're not breathing this stuff in an airborne form, which is great. And we actually haven't found a measurement that exceeded the threshold limit values that are put out by ACGIH, which Laurel mentioned earlier, we both sit on a committee for. We've also taken some noise measurements and measured people's hearing in one of these campaigns. When we asked workers, do you think you work in high noise? About a third of them said, I always or almost always work in high noise. And you saw from the videos there's a lot of impact noise, as well as maybe some grinding and shredding noise. We've made measurements on the average of about 6 hours. We actually haven't come across a single work shift that was over 85 decibels. Again, the threshold limit value for a single work day. But we did find that about 1 in 5 of these workers have a moderate or worse hearing loss. And so one of my suspicions here is that these folks don't necessarily have a huge amount of noise, but they might potentially have exposures to some ototoxic chemicals, lead and mercury being among those. And the combination of a little bit of noise and some chemicals that can also cause hearing loss may be creating this higher than expected prevalence of hearing loss in the community. So we've also done surface wipe sampling, again, going out into people's homes and sampling surfaces that they cook on to try to understand, are these surfaces contaminated? And in fact, in the few places where there were separate working and food preparation areas, we've actually found that the concentrations were almost identical. So we found lead in the work area, and we're also finding lead in the food preparation areas. So this is a potential pathway for an ingestion exposure for things like lead. We've also taken biomarker samples from these folks. So just over 100 people have given us blood samples and urine samples. We are finding lead in the blood of these folks. The lead and cadmium levels have been higher in men, but we've actually seen almost an equal distribution among males and females in terms of actually doing e-waste recycling work. And the people who are doing that work have higher iron, zinc, and lead than some other controls that we were able to sample in the community. For urine, we found the same thing. Workers had more than general community members who didn't do e-waste recycling. And we actually saw some association between lead and kidney function, so that's troubling. We haven't seen anybody who was above the occupational limit, the biological exposure index for lead that's put out by ACGIH, but 30% of the people who have participated are above the CDC recommendations. So we definitely have lead exposure in this community, which of course is a concern. We've also done a ton of interviews, as you can see pictured here. We found that almost 2/3 of the workers that we interviewed were injured in the past 6 months. That's an extraordinarily high injury rate, and the mean was about 1.4 per person. A little over 40% of workers had had more than one injury in the past 6 months, and a little more than 1 in 10 had had more than 3 injuries in 6 months. And some of these injuries are relatively mild. You know, I smashed my finger with a hammer, but some of them are very very severe lacerations, having heavy equipment dropped on you. So there were some severe injuries as well. And we also, through some regression modeling, have found a relationship between injury risk and lack of use of PPE, not uncommon in this community where they don't necessarily have money to buy protective equipment. Also, the specific activities that they're doing with dismantling being absolutely the highest risk of injury. And the people who had the highest noise exposures also had the highest injury risk. So some interesting relationships there. I'll just wrap up here in a couple minutes. So we're also interested again in psychosocial as well as physiological stress. So we actually took a physiological measure of oxidative stress through a measurement of something called 8-OHDG, and found those levels were elevated among male workers, but also among the people who were working longest, more than 48 hours a week. All of these folks reported major concerns about nutrition and food insecurity issues. And, perhaps shocking to no one, we did see that those who smoked tended to have higher blood lead and blood cadmium levels. I'll just mention here, so it's not very satisfying to work with the community and just tell them they have problems. I'm always motivated to try to translate this into an intervention. And working with these workers in the community, we actually were able to prototype some different devices to help them take apart these electronic components, at least as fast as they were doing before, but also in a more safe manner. So I can tell you most of these folks basically grab an old lawnmower blade with no handle or anything, and they hammer that into those statters to break them apart. It's incredibly unsafe and lots of cuts occur. So we actually worked with them to develop a bunch of different tools, did a trial run with them, and finalized this particular tool in the middle, which has a sort of a blade guard. It has a handle they can actually hold onto. It has a thicker side and a thinner side. And we deployed these to 100 folks in the community right as the pandemic started. So we haven't been able to get back to collect our final data, but they've been sending us photos here. And you can see this photo on the right. This worker was actually using our tool and broke it in just 2 weeks. So, anytime we do an engineering intervention, and I will say this intervention we developed in cooperation with the College of Engineering here at Michigan and also the School of Business. So, this was a start. They're giving us some valuable feedback. We're, as soon as we can, going to go back and survey them in terms of differences they might have experienced in terms of income, injuries, and just sort of efficiency with the use of our tool. So just to wrap it up here, we didn't find much in the air, which was kind of shocking to us in terms of metals, but we did find lead on working and food preparation surfaces, and we're finding lead at concerning levels in a sizable fraction of the population. We're not seeing so much noise exposure, at least in terms of being above limits, but we are seeing hearing loss being relatively common for a younger population, which suggests some possible ototoxicities, lots of injuries occurring here, and again, lots of psychological as well as physiological stress. So with that, I am out of time. I know this has been a very quick walk through what I hope is a pretty interesting topic. We've got 15 minutes or so to take questions, which I'd love to do. But I'll also say if any of you are interested in learning more about e-waste, I've given you a couple of websites here. We actually held a workshop back in 2018 here in Ann Arbor, where we had 50 people come in from all around the globe to talk about e-waste and try to identify different kinds of solution from government angles, from business, and from the workforce itself. And of course, if you'd like to learn more about the other kinds of research I do, there's the link to my lab. So with that, I'm going to shut up, and hopefully, Laurel, there's some questions I can answer. But in the meantime, I appreciate everybody hanging with me on a Friday afternoon, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Such impressive work and really amazing. So I have one question. You really collected so much different information from this population in Thailand and have been able to report what the exposures have been. But what about, you mentioned this is done globally. How does your results match with other results that perhaps are being found in other countries or areas?
That is a great question, Laurel. So as I mentioned earlier, I actually started this work in Ghana at Agbogbloshie Market. And frankly, I became kind of sickened with the circumstances there because there were so many researchers. It's such a sort of tragic looking site that there were so many researchers there just doing helicopter research, buzzing passing in and out, no interaction with the workers other than, taking a blood sample. So I frankly was pretty disillusioned with that and decided I wanted to go someplace where people were not being predated, if you will, by researchers. And so I ended up choosing Thailand, which I've talked about here, and Chile as well. And so all of that's a way of saying the conditions we're seeing here are not as bad as what's been commonly reported in Ghana, as well as some places in China, where there are enormous, tens, if not hundreds of acre sites where people are all working together to do this work. So these conditions are not so dire there. I will also say that we've been looking at a lot of exposures that others haven't looked at. So PCBs, PAHs, metals to some extent, these things have been studied by a lot of different research teams. No one's really looking at noise or injuries or psychosocial stress. So we're really trying to fill a gap rather than to compare what we've done to other places, if that answers your question.
Absolutely. That was actually really helpful and informative. And I'm really, again, applaud you for reaching out then to this community so that you really can help shed some light and share resources. So we also have another question, and thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation and learning about your research. My question is related to the potential interventions you are testing. Specifically, what outcomes are you trying to influence besides the physical injury with the new tools? Do you think that your work could also address chemical exposures like lead?
That's an outstanding question. So I'll tell you that this has been one of the most interesting and kind of thought-provoking aspects of this project, was teaming up with someone from engineering and someone from the business school, because I approach this problem with my public health or my occupational health hat on. I want to cut down injuries. I want to keep these people safe and healthy. The engineer, that's not his primary focus. He was trying to think about how we can optimize this circumstance so they're making as much sort of product as they possibly can, processing these electronics as quickly as possible. And then the business school faculty that I'm working with was interested in how can we maximize the income here. And just for comparison, most of these workers said when they got into e-waste recycling, their annual income went up 3 or 4-fold. So now their kids can go to college. This has been a game changer for them. So we have been, the three of us, trying to converge on a Venn diagram here where I'm covering public health, one of them is doing engineering, and one is doing the business case. And we've been very transparent and I would say open with the community to get feedback. What are their concerns? Injuries are their primary concern as well. So we've ended up focusing on that. But the idea of bringing 3 different skill sets, 3 totally different perspectives to a problem has introduced me to lots of thoughts that I never would have had. So for example, I was envisioning us creating a table or something they could work with. And the engineer, drafted up or mocked up a bunch of prototypes, and the community didn't like that at all. Then they were like, we want better tools. And so I sent an undergraduate, I can't even believe I did this. I sent an undergraduate to Thailand with a suitcase full of 24 knives and no customs paperwork. It's phenomenal. I haven't been jailed myself, to deliver to the community to try out. And based on that prototyping step, they were like, this is what we want. And then the business person was asking, well, how are you going to evaluate actually what they want and how happy with it they are? And so we actually introduced a whole auction protocol here where people were able to bid, so we could get a sense of, if you want this tool, how much would you be willing to pay for it, given what you make as an income? So it's been really remarkable, again, to bring together these different perspectives and apply them in a way that's making people healthier, but ideally making them more wealthy as well, and doing the same work faster.
Wow, I really love that interdisciplinary approach, and also you're so right. It's completely different perspectives, all going towards the same thing, and it's amazing how it can really impact how you think about things. So that's really, really awesome. So there's another question here, and I'll just read it directly. Thank you, Dr. Neitzel. Very interesting research on a complicated topic. I have a question on product design for disassembly. Do you think it would be worthwhile to inform electronic producers on ways to improve informal disassembly and material recovery while reducing injuries and all the exposures to toxic materials and such that you discussed?
That's a great question. So I can tell you, for example, the workshop that we held in 2018, we had a number of industry representatives there to try to get their take on this. And I can tell you they are very conflicted because customers demand the thinnest iPhone, the smallest electronics possible with the longest battery life and the brightest screen. And each one of those things you add together makes for a product that's more intricately assembled and sort of constrains them in terms of how they design that product. So in meeting the consumer demand, they've ended up gluing in batteries and things that make it harder to disassemble, but make the customer happy enough to actually buy the product in the first place. Now, the manufacturers, and certainly I think the public is aware that there's a movement towards being able to repair rather than having to discard your device. And I think the manufacturers are fine with that, but they're sort of, again, caught in this position of, well, if I design something that's easy to take apart, it's going to be ugly, it's going to be heavy and thick, and people aren't going to buy it. So I would say they are an integral part of the solution here, but we as consumers are also part of the solution. We are the problem in that we buy these products and discard them. So really it needs to be a multi-partite effort here to address the design components. And I will say there are many people working on those sort of upstream factors. We've focused a little more downstream on the impacts, but that's a great point. And that is sort of where the solution lies in the long term, in my mind.
Great. There's another question, which I think maybe when you talked about this meeting that you had, it relates to that. What do you think the role is of individual level versus systemic level interventions? So I'm assuming the systemic ones would be kind of the government and even the Basel Convention, like everything even bigger, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right. So that is a great question. I would say there are roles for both. So the larger kind of systemic policy-based approaches, like requiring manufacturer take-back of products, those have a lot of potential to get the electronics out of the hands of the consumer and back to the manufacturer, who frankly is probably the best equipped to extract the most value out of that product. If those systems worked perfectly, we wouldn't have informal recycling, but of course they don't work perfectly. It's a porous system. The other reason that I think the individual level interventions like we're proposing are pretty important is these informal economies have sprung up and are now dependent on this. So if we cut off their flow with a systematic fix, we're now putting people back into a worse position than they started. That's going to be a huge quality of life and potentially health impact. So I think both of those approaches are absolutely needed, sort of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. But manufacturer take-back and sort of manufacturer responsibility, I think those are key elements in this discussion as well, absolutely.
So interesting. And it seemed like that your measures were on the workers, but you did highlight the impact that it has on their communities. For example, the rice paddy next door. So in your plans, have you taken measurements with the rice or on the community level about how the impact of this informal industry has on the surrounding communities? Since you also, I was impressed, you also had community engagement, the community health nurses or whatever their titles were. So they probably are also interested in the broader impact that these potential exposures or the potential waste, like even if the workers aren't exposed, but those piles of waste in that pool that you showed. So what is the way in that direction?
Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, I'm happy to report we do have a bunch of rice samples that we collected, both from fields, but also from people's homes. So rice is the staple crop here. Everybody's got a rice storage facility at their home. Those things are in my collaborator's lab in Thailand. We've had to kind of suspend all of our research because the university froze our budgets. Yeah. So we're in a holding pattern on those, but that's absolutely our intention is to look at, okay, we're seeing lead in the blood of our participants and in community members. They're not breathing it in based on our results. They do have it on their food preparation services, but maybe they also have it in their food. And so that's another key pathway that we want to explore and just haven't gotten there yet.
Wow. Wow. That's awesome.
It's like mind-bogglingly complicated when you start mapping out all these pathways, and we're doing the best we can, but it's been a small effort and not a particularly well-funded one. So there are still gaps in our understanding, of course. But I will say I don't know of any other research group that's taken this approach sort of long-term with the community and really kind of soliciting their input and concerns in addition to going in with our own agenda, of course.
Yeah, that is amazing. And I'm so excited then to hear it all come together whenever this pandemic and
Yeah.
everything freezes, go away. Well, I think that is it with our questions. And then we also only have a few minutes left anyway, and it is 5 o'clock your time.
It
So
is.
you definitely get it off. So I just,
coffee. Yeah.
I know. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing this impressive work that you do, which I know is just a fraction because I know you also do a lot of other work. And so I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing this work with us and the students and faculty here at our College of Public Health.
My pleasure. And again, if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to drop me a line. I'd be happy to have a discussion with you. Thank you so much.